There is something about the sea that changes a man. Perhaps it is the endlessness of it, the horizon that never seems to arrive, the water that swallows sound, the nights so dark and so deep that even the stars feel borrowed. Men who sailed those waters for months at a time were not the same men who had left port. They were harder, quieter in some ways, louder in others, and they carried always the tools of their survival close to their bodies, iron and steel and wood, shaped by fire, shaped by need, shaped by a world that offered very little mercy to those who went without. We are talking, of course, about pirates. Not the pirates of children's stories, not the romanticized figures with their theatrical flags and their painted smiles. We are talking about the real men, and sometimes women, who prowled the trade lanes of the Atlantic, the Caribbean, the Indian Ocean, and the South China Sea, during what historians have come to call the Golden Age of piracy, roughly spanning from the 1650s through the early decades of the 1730s. These were individuals operating at the absolute edge of civilization, in a world where law was distant and violence was close, and where the weapons a person carried were often the only argument they ever needed to make. And what weapons they were. When we think of pirates and their arms, the mind tends to go immediately to the cutlass. That broad, slightly curved blade that has become so synonymous with the pirate image that it borders on cliché. But the cutlass was only one thread in a much larger, much more fascinating tapestry. The arsenal of a Golden Age pirate was a practical collection, assembled over voyages, taken from prizes, traded in ports, and maintained with the kind of obsessive care that men give only to the things their lives depend upon. Flintlock pistols worn multiple at a time across the chest, boarding axes for cutting rope and splitting timber, and, when the moment demanded it, splitting far worse things. Long guns that could reach across the water before any ship had closed the distance. Grenades fashioned from glass bottles filled with gunpowder and slow-burning fuse. Knives tucked into boots, into belts, into sleeves. Each weapon tells a story. Each one was the product of craftsmen, of blacksmiths and gunsmiths and bladesmiths working in London and Amsterdam and Port Royal, who likely never imagined their careful labor ending up in the hands of a man standing on a burning deck 1,000 miles from anywhere, with a name on any map, the forge where a cutlass was shaped, the hands that hammered the steel, the bellows that pushed the fire. All of that work, all of that craft, eventually found its way to the sea. Before we continue, if these stories have become part of your nights, consider subscribing to the channel as we prepare another story for you. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of the story. Eventually it found its way into history, because this is the part that often goes unspoken. Pirates shaped the world, not always in ways that are celebrated, and not always in ways that are clean or comfortable to examine, but the pressure they exerted on global trade routes forced colonial powers to reconfigure their navies. Their presence in the Caribbean shifted the economics of the sugar trade. Their activities along the eastern seaboard of the American colonies contributed, indirectly but genuinely, to the frictions that would eventually produce a revolution. And the weapons they wielded, the specific technologies of violence that defined the era, tell us something profound about the age itself, about manufacturing, about metallurgy, about what men were capable of building, and about what men were capable of doing with what they built. A pirate's weapon was never merely a weapon. It was a statement of identity. It was the product of a civilization's accumulated knowledge of how to make things that could end other things. It was, in many cases, an object of genuine beauty, because the craftsmen of the period understood, in a way we sometimes forget, that beauty and lethality are not opposites. The finest pistols of the early 18th century were works of art. The best blades were essays in proportion and balance. The men who carried them were often acutely aware of this. There are accounts of pirates who maintained their weapons with near religious devotion, who polished the brass fittings of their flintlocks in the lantern light of their cabins, while the ship moved slowly through calm water. These were not monsters, though they could be monstrous. They were men of their time, carrying the tools of their time, leaving marks on the world that we are still, quietly, reading. So let us slow down. Let us set aside the rush and the noise and the simplified picture. Let us look, carefully, at the weapons themselves. In the segments ahead, we will examine the cutlass, the flintlock pistol, the boarding axe, the blunderbuss, and the cannon, each in its own time, each in its own light. We begin where most things in history begin, with steel, and with the men who knew how to use it. There is a particular kind of object that history produces only when conditions are exactly right, not designed by committee, not refined over decades in the workshops of academics or aristocrats, but forged, quite literally, out of need, out of the specific, unglamorous, daily demands of a life lived in close quarters, in wet conditions, in spaces too narrow to swing a broadsword and too dangerous to go without something sharp. The cutlass was exactly that kind of object, and understanding it means understanding not just a weapon, but an entire world that made such a weapon inevitable. Let us begin, as we should, at the forge. The blacksmiths who produced the blades that would eventually find their way onto pirate ships were working in a tradition that stretched back centuries. European bladesmithing in the 17th and early 18th centuries was a sophisticated craft, concentrated in particular cities that had built their entire economies around the quality of their steel. Toledo, in Spain, was famous across the known world for the purity of its iron ore and the particular technique its smiths used to fold and work the metal, a process that produced blades of extraordinary flexibility and edge retention. Solingen, in what is now northwestern Germany, had been producing fine blades since the Middle Ages and would continue to do so for centuries to come. And in England, the city of Birmingham was quietly becoming one of the great manufacturing centers of the age, its forges working day and night to supply a world that seemed to have an endless appetite for things made of iron and steel. The process of making a cutlass began, as all bladesmithing begins, with heat. Bar stock, raw iron or steel, depending on the quality of the finished product, was loaded into a coal or charcoal furnace and brought to what smiths called a working heat, a temperature at which the metal became soft enough to shape but had not yet begun to burn or lose structural integrity. A skilled smith could read this temperature by color alone. Bright orange was too cool. White was the threshold of danger. The deep, luminous yellow-orange that experienced smiths called a good forging heat. That was the moment. That was when the tongs came down, pulled the glowing bar from the fire, and the hammer began its work on the anvil. For a cutlass, the shaping process involved drawing out the metal, elongating and thinning the bar through successive hammer blows, and then establishing the characteristic profile of the blade, broad at the base, tapering toward the point, with a single cutting edge and a spine thick enough to absorb the considerable shock of impact without shattering. The slight curve that defines the cutlass was introduced deliberately and for reasons that were entirely practical. A curved blade, when drawn across a surface, concentrates cutting force along a shorter section of edge than a straight blade would. It slices more effectively, and in the context of combat aboard a ship, where the goal was often not a clean thrust, but a fast, powerful draw cut across whatever was in range. That slicing efficiency was not a luxury. It was the entire point. After the initial shaping came grinding. The edge of a cutlass blade was established and refined on large grinding wheels, often water-powered in the major production centers, that spun continuously and against which the smith or a specialized grinder would press the blade at carefully controlled angles. This was skilled, patient work. The bevel, The angled surface that leads to the actual cutting edge had to be consistent along the entire length of the blade, or the weapon would cut unevenly, catch in unexpected ways, and fail at precisely the moments it was most needed. Good grinders were valued craftsmen, and the workshops of Toledo and Solingen were full of men who had spent their entire lives learning to read the sound and feel of steel against stone, who could tell by the pitch of the grinding wheel's song whether the angle was right or needed correction. Then came tempering. This is the step that separates a blade from a bar of shaped metal. After grinding, the cutlass was heated once more, this time to a precise lower temperature, and then quenched rapidly in water or oil. The sudden cooling locked the crystal structure of the steel into a hardened state, giving the edge the ability to hold a sharp point under use. But hardness alone is brittle, and a blade that is only hard will shatter under lateral stress. So after hardening came tempering proper, a second, gentler heating to a lower temperature still, followed by a slow cool. This drew some of the hardness back out of the steel and introduced toughness, the ability to flex slightly rather than crack. The balance between hardness and toughness in a well-made cutlass was, and remains, a genuinely impressive technical achievement. These were not crude instruments. They were carefully engineered tools. The finished blade was then fitted with a guard and a handle, what smiths and historians call the furniture of the weapon. For working cutlasses intended for naval or pirate use, the guard was typically simple and robust, a solid brass or iron D-guard, shaped like the letter it resembles, that wrapped around the knuckles and protected the hand during close-quarters fighting. There were no elaborate decorations here, no gilded flourishes of the kind you might find on a gentleman's dress sword. The cutlass was a working weapon, and its furniture reflected that: practical, durable, replaceable. The grip itself was usually wood, sometimes wrapped in leather or wire for better purchase in wet hands, because wet hands were a constant reality aboard a ship. Rivets or pins secured it to the tang, the portion of the blade that extended back into the handle, and the whole assembly was checked for balance. A well-balanced cutlass felt, when held, almost weightless. The weight distribution between blade and handle was calibrated so that the weapon moved naturally with the motion of the wrist, not fighting the user, but extending from them, becoming briefly a part of the body it was attached to. Now, why the cutlass, specifically for pirates? The answer unfolds the moment you step, in your imagination, onto the deck of a ship in the early 18th century. Space is the first thing you notice, or rather, the absence of it. Sailing vessels of the period were cramped in ways that are difficult to convey to a modern reader accustomed to space as a given. Decks were low. Rigging came down at every angle. Barrels, lines, cannon carriages, and the bodies of crew members filled every available area. In this environment, a long weapon was nearly useless. A rapier, that elegant thrusting weapon beloved of European duelists, required room to extend, room to maneuver, room that a ship deck simply did not provide. A broadsword demanded a wide, sweeping arc that would as likely catch a rigging line or a fellow crewman as an opponent. The cutlass required none of that. Its short blade, typically between 25 and 35 inches in total length, could be deployed in a space barely wider than a man's shoulders. Its curved edge rewarded the chopping, pulling motions that came naturally when fighting in close, when there was no room to step back, when the only direction was forward or down. It was, in the most direct sense, the right tool for the environment. Ships did not make the cutlass popular among pirates and sailors. The cutlass was popular among pirates and sailors because the ship made everything else impractical. There is also the question of maintenance. A cutlass was forgiving in a way that finer blades were not. Salt air is the enemy of steel. It oxidizes the surface, pits the metal, degrades an edge over time with a persistence that seems almost personal. Weapons that depended on extremely fine geometry, on mirror-polished surfaces and razor-thin edges, suffered greatly in the marine environment. The cutlass, with its robust blade and its single, relatively thick edge, was far more tolerant of imperfect conditions. It could be cleaned with cloth and tallow. Its edge could be restored with a basic sharpening stone. It did not demand the obsessive, specialist care that more refined weapons required for a crew that might be months from the nearest port where a skilled grinder could be found. This resilience was worth more than any amount of elegance. Among the pirates of the Golden Age, the cutlass became something close to a universal tool, not just a weapon, a utility. Accounts from the period describe pirates using their cutlasses to cut rope, to open crates, to chop through wooden fixtures when boarding a prize vessel. The blade that could open a man's shoulder in combat could, 10 minutes later, be used to cut the lashings on a barrel of rum. This versatility only deepened the attachment that sailors developed for their blades. Some were named, some were passed down, some were taken from defeated enemies and worn as evidence of a story. They were, in the end, more than iron and steel. They were the defining object of an era, carried by men who lived at the margins of the civilized world, forged by craftsmen who would never know the use their work was put to, shaped by necessity into something that was, in its own blunt and unadorned way, perfect. The cutlass did not survive the Golden Age unchanged. Navies would later develop more standardized versions for their sailors, regulated, mass-produced, uniform in a way the pirate cutlass never was. But the soul of the weapon remained the same: practical, direct, forged from need. And somewhere, in the bottom of the Caribbean Sea, there are cutlasses still lying in the dark, resting on the hulls of ships that found the reef instead of the harbor, waiting with great patience in the salt and the silence. There is a moment, well documented in the journals and trial transcripts of the Golden Age, that tells you almost everything you need to know about how pirates understood the flintlock pistol. It is not a moment of firing, it is a moment of wearing. Accounts from the period, court depositions, merchant captain testimonies, the written recollections of survivors who had been boarded and robbed and left, shaking on their own decks, describe again and again the same image. A pirate coming over the rail, coming through the smoke and the noise, and across his chest, tucked into a broad leather bandolier, or hanging from silk ribbons knotted at the shoulder, a collection of pistols. Not one, not two, sometimes four, sometimes six. Bartholomew Roberts, one of the most successful pirates in the historical record, was described by contemporaries as wearing multiple pistols slung across his body in precisely this fashion. Edward Teach, the man history remembers as Blackbeard, allegedly went into battle with as many as 6 pistols on his person, in addition to a brace of knives and a cutlass at his hip. Why so many? The answer is the flintlock mechanism itself. And to understand it, we need to slow down and look very carefully at a piece of engineering that was, for its time, nothing short of extraordinary. The flintlock pistol represented the culmination of roughly 2 centuries of incremental improvement in personal firearms. Its predecessors, the matchlock and the wheelock, had each solved the fundamental problem of portable firearms in their own ways, and each had introduced new problems in the solving. The matchlock required a burning length of slow match cord to be kept lit at all times, a practical impossibility in rain or wind, or the spray of a ship's deck. The wheelock, which used a spinning wheel of serrated steel to strike sparks from a piece of iron pyrite, was mechanically complex and expensive to produce, and its intricate internal mechanism was vulnerable to the grit and moisture of hard use. The flintlock was different. Its mechanism was elegant in the way that the best engineering always is. Not simple exactly, but reduced to its essential components, each one doing exactly what it needed to do and nothing more. The heart of the system was the cock, a sprung, jaw-like arm that held a carefully shaped piece of flint clamped between its jaws. When the trigger was pulled, the cock was released by its mainspring, a powerful, carefully tempered piece of steel, and swung forward in a fast, precise arc. The flint struck the frizzen, a curved plate of hardened steel mounted above the pan, and the impact produced a shower of sparks while simultaneously knocking the frizzen forward and exposing the priming powder in the pan below. The sparks fell into the priming powder. The priming powder ignited. A small flame shot through the touch hole into the main powder charge in the barrel. The main charge detonated. The ball was launched. All of this happened in a fraction of a second. What is remarkable is not simply that it worked, but that it worked as reliably as it did, given the conditions under which it was expected to perform. Gunsmiths of the period were working with hand tools, with files and drills and lathes driven by foot pedals, producing components that had to interact with tolerances measured in fractions of a millimeter. The mainspring had to be strong enough to drive the cock forward with sufficient force to produce sparks, but not so strong that the trigger pull became unmanageable. The flint had to be sharp enough to strip sparks from the frizzen reliably, but mounted at precisely the right angle, and with just the right amount of projection from the jaws of the cock. The pan had to be deep enough to hold the priming powder securely, but shallow enough that the sparks could reliably ignite it. These were not simple problems. The gunsmiths who solved them were among the finest precision craftsmen of their age. The workshops where flintlock pistols were produced in quantity were concentrated, much like the bladesmithing centers we discussed in our previous segment, in specific cities that had developed the necessary concentration of expertise and infrastructure. London was perhaps the most prestigious address for a pistol. English gunmakers of the late 17th and early 18th centuries had developed a reputation for quality that commanded premium prices across Europe and the colonies. The Tower of London maintained official contracts with approved gunmakers, and the proof marks stamped into barrels and locks by the London Gunmakers Company were a reliable guarantee of minimum standards. Birmingham, already rising as a manufacturing centre, produced enormous quantities of more affordable weapons that found their way into militias, trading ships, and eventually pirate hands. The barrel of a flintlock pistol was perhaps the most technically demanding component to produce. It began as a flat strip of iron wrapped around a mandrel, a solid rod of the desired bore diameter, and forge welded along its length into a tube. This process, called scalp welding, required extraordinary skill and patience, because any flaw in the weld, any inclusion of slag or gap in the fusion, created a point of weakness that could cause the barrel to rupture catastrophically under the pressure of firing. A ruptured barrel did not merely fail, it exploded, and it did so in the hands of the person holding it. Gunsmiths knew this. The proof testing that finished barrels underwent before being fitted to locks, firing overloaded charges to verify structural integrity, was not a formality. It was a genuine test, and barrels failed it with enough regularity that the practice was considered essential. After welding and proof, the barrel was bored. A cutting tool was drawn through the interior to establish the precise diameter of the bore and ensure its straightness, and then finished externally. The exterior might be left in the dark, slightly rough finish of the file and the forge, or it might be polished to a brighter surface, or, on finer weapons, browned or blued through controlled oxidation processes that provided both a degree of rust resistance and a particular aesthetic quality. The lock, the mechanism itself, was assembled from components made by specialists. In the major gun-making centers, the trade was divided among locksmiths who made the mechanism, stockers who shaped the wooden stock, barrel makers who produced the tubes, and finishers who assembled and regulated the completed weapon. A single pistol might pass through 4 or 5 pairs of hands before it was complete. This division of labor was an early version of what we now call manufacturing, a recognition that specialization produced better results than any single craftsman trying to master every component. Now, back to the ship. back to the deck, and the question of why pirates wore so many of them. The flintlock pistol, for all its elegance, had one profound and inescapable limitation. It was a single-shot weapon. Once fired, it was empty. Reloading, measuring a powder charge, patching and seating a ball, priming the pan, required time that could be measured in minutes, even for an experienced shooter, and in the middle of a boarding action, minutes were simply not available. A pirate who fired his pistol and then stood there fumbling with a powder horn while an opponent recovered and advanced was a pirate in serious difficulty. The solution was not to reload. The solution was to carry more pistols. This is why the image of the pistol-laden pirate, so often dismissed as theatrical exaggeration, is in fact a precise and rational response to the mechanical realities of the weapon. Each pistol represented one shot, one moment of decisive firepower. A man carrying 6 pistols could fire 6 times before resorting to his blade. 6 moments in which the course of a fight could be decided before it became a melee. The bandolier was not a costume, it was a reload system. Each pistol, once fired, was simply dropped or tucked aside, and the next was drawn. Blackbeard, in particular, seems to have understood the psychological dimension of this arrangement with unusual clarity. The image of a large man coming over a rail with 6 pistols visible on his body, smoke perhaps still rising from a recent cannon exchange, his face framed by the slow match cords he allegedly wove into his beard and set smoldering before battle. That image was designed to produce a specific response in the people seeing it for the first time. Terror. Immediate, visceral, decision-ending terror. Many merchant captains surrendered before a shot was fired. The weapons were, in those cases, not tools of violence at all. They were tools of theater, of intimidation. And they worked because every person on the receiving end of that image understood, at some level, exactly what those pistols represented. This duality, the flintlock as both genuine instrument of lethal force and instrument of psychological dominance, runs through the entire history of pirate firearms. Pirates who could not afford large crews, who were often numerically inferior to the vessels they were attempting to take, had powerful incentives to end confrontations before they became genuine fights. A fight cost ammunition. It cost crew members who were difficult to replace. It cost time and created noise that might attract unwanted attention. A surrender cost nothing but dignity, and dignity was a currency that piracy had already asked its practitioners to spend freely. The flintlock pistol, worn in multiples, made surrender feel like the only reasonable option. That is a remarkable thing for a piece of iron and wood and flint to accomplish. And yet the craftsmen who made them, the locksmiths of London and Birmingham, the barrel welders bending over their anvils in the early morning dark, had no idea. They were solving engineering problems. They were filling contracts. They were making things that worked. The world, as it so often does, supplied the rest. There is a category of object that resists simple classification, not quite weapon, not quite tool, something that exists in the space between the two, that moves fluidly from one identity to the other depending on the moment, depending on the need, depending on what the next 30 seconds require of the person holding it. In the history of human-made things, these dual-natured objects are often the most interesting to examine, because they reveal with unusual clarity the conditions that produced them. They are objects shaped not by a single purpose, but by an entire way of life. The boarding axe is exactly such an object. To look at one, and several have survived into museum collections, resting now behind glass in maritime institutions in London and Amsterdam and Newport, Rhode Island, is to hold 2 contradictory impressions simultaneously. The first is of a tool. The proportions are workmanlike. The handle is plain wood, straight or very slightly curved, long enough for a 2-handed grip, but short enough to be swung in tight quarters. The head is functional, undecorated, shaped with the practical efficiency of something made to do a job. You could imagine it in the hands of a carpenter. You could imagine it splitting firewood on a cold morning somewhere inland, somewhere quiet, somewhere entirely removed from the smell of salt water and burning powder. And then you notice the edge, not the axe blade itself, though that is sharp enough, ground to a proper working bevel, but the spike. Most boarding axes of the period featured a secondary point projecting from the back of the head, opposite the blade, a heavy, tapered spike of iron, designed with a specificity of purpose that removes any ambiguity about what this object was also intended to do. This was not a carpenter's tool with a spike added as an afterthought. This was something designed, from the beginning, to perform two very different kinds of work. And the presence of that spike is the detail that opens the entire history of the weapon. Let us begin, as always, at the forge. The production of a boarding axe head was, compared to the manufacture of a cutlass blade or a flintlock lock mechanism, relatively straightforward metalwork. This is not to diminish it. Smithing of any kind demands skill, and the specific demands of an axe head, the need for a hardened, well-supported cutting edge married to a tough, shock-resistant body, required a smith who understood the behavior of steel under stress. But the boarding axe did not require the refined geometry of a sword blade or the microscopic tolerances of a lock mechanism. It was robust work, honest work, the kind of smithing that formed the backbone of the trade in any port town large enough to have a forge at all. The head was typically made by a process called forge welding of dissimilar materials, a technique that took advantage of the different properties of iron and steel by combining them in a single piece. The body of the axe head, the bulk of the metal that provided mass and structural strength, was made of wrought iron, tough, flexible, resistant to the cracking and shattering that harder materials were prone to under impact. The cutting edge, however, needed to be harder than wrought iron could achieve, hard enough to hold a serviceable edge through repeated use against wood, rope, and occasionally things far less forgiving than either. To solve this, smiths would weld a steel bit, a small, wedge-shaped piece of higher carbon steel, into the cutting edge of the iron body. The two materials were brought to welding heat together in the forge and then hammered into fusion on the anvil, the smith working quickly and with considerable force to create a bond between the materials at the molecular level. When done well, the resulting piece was seamless, iron and steel married into a single head that combined toughness and edge retention in a way that neither material could have achieved alone. When done poorly, the weld failed, usually at the worst possible moment, under the shock of a hard blow, and the edge separated from the body, rendering the tool immediately useless. This is why the quality of a smith mattered, not just in the abstract sense that quality always matters, but in the immediate, personal, life or death sense that was the constant backdrop of a pirate's working existence. The handle, the haft, was shaped from hardwood. Ash was preferred when available, for the same reasons it was favored for tool handles. Generally, it was strong along the grain, had a natural degree of flexibility that helped absorb shock, and could be replaced in the field when it split or broke, which it inevitably did. The head was fitted to the haft through a tapered eye, an oval hole through the head, and then secured with a wooden or iron wedge driven into the top of the handle after fitting. This wedge system, which caused the wood to expand against the inside of the eye when driven home, created a joint that tightened under use rather than loosening. The harder you swung the axe, the more firmly the head seated itself on the handle. It was, again, engineering of elegant simplicity, a solution that understood the problem it was solving with great precision. Now let us step aboard the ship. Let us think about what the boarding axe was actually for. The name tells you something, but not everything. Boarding, the act of one crew crossing onto the deck of another vessel, was the central defining act of piracy. Everything else led to it, or followed from it. The cannon fire, if there was cannon fire, was intended to slow the prize vessel and encourage its crew toward surrender. The pistol shots, the shouting, the raised flags, all of it was prologue. The boarding was the moment, and the boarding axe was indispensable to that moment in ways that went well beyond simple combat. Consider the geometry of two ships brought alongside each other. They are moving vessels, subject to swell and wind and current, and they are constructed of wood, surfaces that are vertical, curved, irregular, interrupted by gun ports and railings and the various protrusions of deck furniture. Getting from one ship to the other required crossing a gap that might be several feet wide, across water that was quite possibly not calm, onto a surface controlled by people who very much did not want you there. Pirates accomplished this in several ways. Grappling hooks thrown to catch on railings and rigging, planks laid across the gap, in some cases simply jumping. But the transition, however managed, deposited the boarding party on the enemy deck in a state of immediate vulnerability. The axe was the first tool of gaining purchase. If a boarding party came over the rail and found the way forward blocked by a barricade hastily erected from spare timber and coiled rope, which was a common defensive measure aboard merchant vessels that anticipated attack, the axe was what moved that barricade. If the enemy crew retreated below decks and attempted to hold the hatches against entry from above, the axe was what opened those hatches. If rigging and lines needed to be cut to prevent the prize vessel from getting underway again, to keep it alongside while the work of looting proceeded, the axe cut them. If a panicked merchant crew attempted to cut the grappling lines that held the two ships together, the axe of a defending pirate restoring those lines was the answer. In this sense, the boarding axe was less a weapon than a master key. It opened things. It solved the problem of physical obstruction in the most direct possible way. And its weight. A typical head ran between 2 and 4 pounds, mounted on a handle of perhaps 18 to 24 inches, gave it a mechanical advantage that made it extraordinarily effective against the wooden construction of a period sailing vessel. Planking that would have resisted a blade or a shoulder could be breached in a handful of blows. Door frames, hatch covers, crate lids, barrel tops, all of it yielded to a properly wielded axe in the hands of a determined person. But we cannot ignore the spike, because there were moments. There were always moments when the work of the boarding axe became something other than carpentry. When the crew of a prize vessel chose to fight rather than surrender. When the space was too close and the action too fast for a cutlass to be drawn and deployed properly. In those moments, the boarding axe became something altogether different. The spike on its back face was the acknowledgement, built into the object's very design, that the line between tool and weapon was one that circumstances could erase in an instant. Accounts from the period are not always specific about the instruments involved in particular acts of violence. The trial records and the contemporary newspaper accounts tend toward the general rather than the forensic, but the boarding axe appears often enough in the inventories of captured pirate vessels and in the hands of boarding parties in contemporary illustrations and engravings to confirm its status as a standard piece of kit. It was carried by men who expected to use it for multiple purposes and who valued, above almost anything else, the kind of tool that did not require them to make a decision about which purpose they were pursuing at any given moment. There is something in this that speaks to a broader truth about the pirate existence. These were not men who had the luxury of specialization. A naval officer aboard a Royal Navy warship inhabited a hierarchy in which different tools were the province of different people. The carpenter had his tools, the gunner had his, the Marines had theirs. Roles were defined and defended. But a pirate crew operated with smaller numbers, looser structure, and a constant shortage of everything that civilization could provide in abundance. In that environment, the object that could do many things was worth more than the object that could do one thing perfectly. The boarding axe, in its blocky and unpretentious way, embodied that philosophy completely. It was not beautiful in the manner of a fine pistol or a well-balanced cutlass. It made no claim to elegance, but pick one up, feel the weight of it, the way the head pulls forward and downward, the way the handle feels the palm, and you understand immediately why it was carried. It feels capable. It feels ready. It feels in a way that is difficult to articulate, but impossible to miss, like an object that has already made peace with whatever it is going to be asked to do. The boarding axe did not survive the Golden Age as a celebrated artifact in the way the cutlass and the pistol did. It was too workmanlike for legend, too practical for romance. The stories went to the blades and the guns, to the weapons that carried individual names and individual histories. But the doors those stories walked through, quite often, quite literally, were opened by an axe. There is a particular kind of sound that, once heard, is never forgotten. Not the sharp, precise crack of a pistol. That quick, almost delicate report that arrives and is gone before the mind has fully registered it. Not the deep, chest-compressing concussion of a cannon, which belongs to a different category of experience entirely. A sound that is felt as much as heard. The blunderbuss occupies its own acoustic territory, somewhere between these two extremes, and the people who encountered it in the confined spaces of a ship's companionway or the crowded chaos of a boarded deck described it in terms that suggest something closer to a physical event than a simple noise. A roar, a blast, a sound that seemed to fill whatever space it was fired into and leave, in the ringing silence that followed, a very clear message about what had just happened and what was capable of happening again. The blunderbuss was, in many ways, the weapon that the golden age of piracy deserved. Ungainly by the standards of formal firearms design, imprecise in ways that would have horrified a military musketeer trained in the volley-fire disciplines of European land warfare. Loud beyond what its modest dimensions seemed to promise, and, in the specific environments where pirates lived and worked and fought, narrow passageways, crowded decks, doorways and hatches, and the dark interiors of prize vessels, more effective, more terrifying, and more practically suited to the work at hand than almost any other firearm available in the period. To understand why, we need to understand what the blunderbuss actually was. At its most basic, the blunderbuss was a short-barreled firearm with a dramatically flared muzzle. The opening at the end of the barrel expanded outward in a pronounced bell or trumpet shape that gave the weapon its most immediately recognizable visual characteristic. This flare was not decorative, though it had the incidental effect of giving the blunderbuss a somewhat theatrical appearance that suited the theatrical temperament of the age. It was functional, and its function was rooted in the nature of what the blunderbuss fired. Because the blunderbuss was not designed around a single projectile, where the pistol fired a single lead ball, carefully sized to match the bore of its barrel, and patched with cloth to ensure a good seal against the propellant gases that would drive it forward. The blunderbuss fired a charge of multiple projectiles simultaneously, lead shot of various sizes, scrap iron, nails, broken glass, gravel in documented cases of desperation, whatever was available and could be rammed down the barrel and would emerge from the muzzle with sufficient velocity to do harm. The blunderbuss was, in this sense, less a firearm in the traditional sense, and more a device for launching a cloud of lethal material in a general direction. The flared muzzle served this purpose in two ways. The first was practical loading. A wide muzzle opening made it dramatically faster to charge the weapon. The loose shot could be poured in from a container without the careful individual loading procedure that a tight-bore pistol demanded. In a situation where reloading speed mattered, this was not a trivial advantage. A practiced user could reload a blunderbuss in a fraction of the time it would have taken to reload a standard pistol, particularly in low light, in motion, with hands that might not be entirely steady. The second function of the flare was more contested among historians, and the debate itself is instructive. For many years, the received wisdom held that the flared muzzle of the blunderbuss was designed to spread the shot charge in a wide pattern upon leaving the muzzle, functioning essentially as a portable scattergun whose effective killing radius increased dramatically because the projectiles dispersed. This is an appealing explanation. It fits the intuitive logic of the weapon's design and matches the way we tend to think about shotguns today. And it is, unfortunately, largely incorrect. The physics of a shot charge, fired from a short barrel, are such that the spread of the projectiles is primarily determined by the interior of the barrel rather than the shape of the muzzle. The flare, by the time the shot reaches it, has already cleared the rifled or smoothbore portion of the barrel where the actual acceleration occurs, and the brief milliseconds during which the charge interacts with the flared section are insufficient to meaningfully alter the dispersion pattern. What the muzzle flare does accomplish, and this is genuinely useful, if less dramatic than the popular imagination would prefer, is to direct the muzzle blast, the expanding gases that follow the shot charge out of the barrel, somewhat downward and outward. This reduces the degree to which the blast obscures the shooter's vision immediately after firing, and makes the weapon marginally more comfortable to fire from the hip, which was the common method in close quarters use. The spread of a blunderbuss charge was real, but it was a product of the short barrel length and the loose fit of the multiple projectiles, rather than the shape of the muzzle. In practical terms, at the ranges at which a blunderbuss was typically employed, across the ship's companionway, through a hatchway, into a crowd of men packed onto a deck, this distinction mattered very little. At 10 feet, a blunderbuss loaded with a mixed charge of shot and scrap was devastating regardless of its precise dispersion pattern. The gunsmiths who made them were working with the same basic toolkit as those who produced pistols and muskets, but the blunderbuss made different demands on their craft. The barrel, being short, typically between 12 and 24 inches, compared to the 30-plus inches of a standard military musket, required less raw material and less time to produce, but the flared muzzle demanded additional work. The bell had to be formed carefully, whether by swaging the hot metal outward over a mandrel or by forge, welding a separately made muzzle section to the barrel tube. The junction between the cylindrical portion of the barrel and the beginning of the flare was a point of potential weakness, and conscientious makers reinforced it with additional material. Less conscientious makers did not, and their barrels occasionally demonstrated this choice in ways that were memorable and extremely final for everyone in the immediate vicinity. The lock mechanism on a blunderbuss was, in most cases, a standard flintlock. The same elegant system we examined in our previous segment, scaled appropriately for the larger weapon. Some blunderbusses were produced with a spring-loaded frizzen that snapped open automatically as the cock fell, rather than being pushed open by the flint itself. This was a refinement intended to increase ignition reliability, particularly in damp conditions, and it appeared on quality weapons produced for naval and coaching use, where dependability in adverse weather was a premium consideration. The stock, the wooden body of the weapon, was typically shorter and more robustly proportioned than that of a pistol or musket, reflecting the nature of the weapon's use. A blunderbuss was rarely aimed in any precise sense. It was pointed. The broad, rounded butt was pressed to the shoulder or tucked against the hip. The barrel was directed at the general mass of whatever needed to be stopped, and the trigger was pulled. Sighting systems, where they existed at all, were perfunctory. A small front bead, a notch at the breech. The blunderbuss was not a precision instrument and made no pretense of being one. This honesty about its own nature is, in its way, one of the most appealing things about the weapon. For pirate use specifically, the blunderbuss found its natural home in a handful of scenarios that recurred throughout the Golden Age, with enough regularity to be considered defining features of the trade. The first was the defense of a hatchway, when a prize vessel's crew retreated below decks and attempted to hold the lower spaces against the boarding party above. The narrow, rectangular opening of a hatch became a choke point of enormous tactical significance. For the defenders below, it was a point they could hold with very few men. Anyone attempting to descend the ladder was exposed and vulnerable. For the attackers above, it was a problem that demanded a solution other than sending men one at a time down a ladder into the weapons of the crew below. The blunderbuss was that solution. A single blunderbuss, discharged down a hatchway into the space below, produced effects that extended well beyond whatever its shot physically struck. The blast in an enclosed space was extraordinary. A sound and a pressure wave that was, in a low-ceilinged hold, nearly indistinguishable from something catastrophic. The spreading charge covered the entire width of the hatch and swept the area immediately below it. And the material result, combined with the acoustic and psychological shock, very often produced the rapid disorganization of whatever resistance had been organizing in the darkness below. The second scenario was the companionway, the narrow interior corridor that ran the length of a ship's lower decks. These passages, barely wide enough for two men to pass each other sideways, were environments in which the conventional advantages of trained swordsmanship or careful pistol marksmanship became nearly irrelevant. There was no room to fence. There was no meaningful distance at which to aim. What mattered was stopping power, the ability to fill a confined space with enough lethal material that whoever was coming down that corridor was stopped before they arrived. A blunderbuss, fired into a companionway, was devastatingly effective in precisely this regard. Pirates who understood their work knew that controlling the interior spaces of a prize vessel was frequently more important than controlling its deck. A crew that retreated below and organized resistance could make the looting of the ship extremely costly in terms of time and casualties. The blunderbuss, used aggressively at the entrances to those interior spaces, was one of the primary means by which that resistance was discouraged or ended quickly. There was also the matter of intimidation, which runs as a constant theme through any examination of pirate weaponry. The blunderbuss was loud in a way that communicated its nature immediately to anyone who heard it. A single discharge in a confined space left no ambiguity about what had just happened or what could happen again. And pirates, who were always working the calculus between actual violence and the threat of violence, understood that a weapon which made its capabilities this audible and this visible was doing a portion of its work simply by being present and recognized. Several contemporary accounts describe merchants surrendering their vessels not after being fired upon, but after witnessing a blunderbuss discharged in the air during the approach, a deliberate demonstration, a performance of capability intended to collapse the will to resist before the boarding even began. The weapon was its own argument, and it made that argument in a register that bypassed the reasoning mind entirely and spoke directly to something older and more immediate. This was understood. This was used, deliberately, and with considerable sophistication by men who are not always credited with sophistication, because the blunderbuss, for all its crudeness of principle and its absence of elegance, required a user who understood something subtle, that the most effective violence is often the violence that does not have to occur, that the goal was the prize, and the prize was best taken intact, with minimal resistance, from a crew that had been thoroughly persuaded that resistance was not a viable option. The blunderbuss, in the hands of a pirate who understood this, was not primarily a killing instrument. It was a convincing argument, loud, short-ranged, and absolutely impossible to ignore. There is a moment that every merchant captain of the Golden Age dreaded above all others. Not the storm, though storms were terrible. Not the reef, though reefs were final. Not even the appearance of a strange sail on the horizon, though that could mean many things and few of them were good. The moment that stopped the blood, that turned competent and experienced men suddenly quiet and very still, was the moment when that strange sail resolved itself into something recognizable, when the flag went up, that removed all ambiguity about intentions, and then, confirming everything, ending all possibility of comfortable uncertainty, the sound arrived across the water. A deep, resonant, chest-filling concussion that was less a noise than a physical event. A pressure wave that could be felt in the sternum before the ears had fully processed it, followed, a moment later, by the sound of something moving through the air at tremendous speed, and then either silence or impact. And either way, the message was identical and perfectly clear. You have been found. You have been chosen. And the ship that found you has a cannon. The cannon was not merely a weapon in the world of the golden age of piracy. It was the fundamental fact around which everything else organized itself. The cutlass and the pistol and the boarding axe and the blunderbuss were all instruments of the close, personal, final stage of a confrontation that the cannon had already decided. The cannon determined whether there would be a boarding at all. It determined the terms on which ships approached each other, the distances at which negotiations, if they could be called that, occurred. The willingness of crews to resist or surrender before a single man had crossed from one deck to another. To understand piracy without understanding the cannon is to understand the last chapter of a book while knowing nothing of the first. And to understand the cannon, we must once again go back to the forge, back to the furnace, back to the extraordinary, dangerous, magnificent process of making something capable of containing and directing an explosion. The production of a cannon in the 17th and early 18th centuries was among the most demanding industrial undertakings available to the period. It required infrastructure, furnaces capable of generating and sustaining heat far beyond what a blacksmith's forge could achieve, facilities for handling and pouring metal in quantities measured in hundreds of pounds, specialized tooling for boring and finishing that pushed the limits of contemporary mechanical engineering. Cannon founding, as the craft was called, was not a trade for small operations or modest ambitions. It was concentrated in major industrial centers, the Weald of southern England, with its ancient iron founding tradition and its abundant charcoal fuel. The foundries of the Netherlands, particularly in the cities of the province of Holland, and later, as the century progressed, in Sweden, whose iron ore deposits and technical sophistication would make Swedish cannon among the most sought after in the world. The process began with the iron itself, pig iron, the raw product of a blast furnace, where iron ore was reduced to metal by sustained high heat and carbon-rich fuel, was the starting material for cast iron cannon, which represented the majority of artillery production in the period. Pig iron was brittle by the standards of wrought iron or steel, prone to cracking under sudden shock, and this brittleness was the central challenge of cannon founding. A cannon that cracked under the pressure of firing did not fail gracefully. It failed catastrophically, explosively, in all directions simultaneously, and the consequences for everyone in the immediate vicinity were final. The founder's task was to produce a casting of sufficient density, sufficient freedom from internal voids and inclusions, and sufficient consistency of composition that the finished piece could contain the violence of repeated firing without failing. This was accomplished through careful preparation of the melt, maintaining the iron at the correct temperature for long enough that the metal became fully fluid and the dross and impurities could be skimmed from the surface, and through the design of the mold and the gating system that directed the flowing metal into it. The mold for a cannon was itself an engineering achievement. It was constructed from a carefully prepared mixture of loam, a sandy, clay-rich soil that was built up in layers around a central core and allowed to dry thoroughly between applications. The core, which defined the interior bore of the cannon, was a separate assembly of the same material built around an iron spindle. Getting the alignment between the outer mold and the inner core exactly right was critical, because any eccentricity, any deviation of the bore from the true center of the exterior, created variations in wall thickness that introduced weaknesses. A cannon with walls of uneven thickness would preferentially fail at its thinnest point, which was also unpredictable and therefore unmanageable. When the mold was prepared and dried and assembled in the casting pit, a trench excavated below the floor of the foundry, oriented so that the cannon would be cast muzzle downward, which allowed gravity to draw the densest, cleanest metal to the breech where pressures were highest. The iron was released from the furnace and allowed to flow down the channels cut for it into the waiting form. The pour was fast, necessarily, because iron that began to cool before the mold was full would solidify incompletely and produce a flawed casting. Bounders worked with practiced urgency, monitoring the flow, managing the heat, watching for the signs that told an experienced eye whether the pour was going well or catastrophically otherwise. Then came cooling, hours of it, sometimes days. And then when the metal had solidified and the mold was broken away, what emerged was not yet a cannon. It was a rough casting, the correct general shape, but covered in the texture of the mold material, with the sprues and gates of the casting system still attached, and most critically, without its finished bore. Because cannon of the period were cast around a core that left only an approximate bore, and the final precise interior diameter was established by boring, a machining operation in which a cutting tool was driven through the casting to remove metal and establish the exact dimensions and surface finish of the chamber and bore. Boring a cannon was slow, laborious work. The boring mill, a water-powered machine in which either the cannon rotated while a fixed cutting tool was advanced into it, or the cutting tool rotated while the cannon was held stationary, was one of the more impressive pieces of machinery of the age. The precision it achieved was remarkable given that everything about the process was operating at the extreme edge of what contemporary technology could accomplish. A well-bored cannon had a bore that was smooth, straight, and consistent in diameter along its entire length. These properties were not merely aesthetic, they determined how well a cannonball would fit the bore, how efficiently the propellant gases would be directed behind the ball rather than escaping around it, and how consistently the piece would perform from shot to shot. Inconsistency in a cannon was dangerous in all directions. Now let us consider what these instruments were doing aboard a pirate vessel. The relationship between pirates and cannon was, like so much about piracy, defined by practical necessity rather than military doctrine. Naval warships of the period were purpose-built fighting platforms, designed from the keel up to carry the maximum number of cannon their tonnage could support and to fight in the formal line of battle tactics that European navies had developed across the 17th century. A first-rate ship of the line might carry 100 guns or more on multiple decks, crewed by hundreds of trained men, operating within a command hierarchy designed specifically to manage the coordinated use of that artillery. Pirate vessels were different in almost every respect. Pirates operated primarily from smaller, faster vessels, sloops and brigantines and schooners, that prized speed and maneuverability over raw firepower. The logic was straightforward. A pirate ship that could not catch a merchant vessel was useless, and a pirate ship that could not escape a naval patrol was finished. Cannon added weight, and weight cost speed. Every gun mounted was a calculation. The offensive and intimidation value of the piece weighed against the reduction in performance it imposed on the vessel carrying it. The typical pirate vessel might carry anywhere from 4 to 20 guns, depending on its size and the ambitions of its captain. These were not the massive 24 or 32-pound guns that formed the main battery of a ship of the line, hurling balls of iron nearly the size of a man's head across distances measured in hundreds of yards. They were lighter pieces, 4-pounders, 6-pounders, occasionally 9-pounders, weapons that could be managed by smaller crews and that imposed less structural demand on the lighter hulls of the vessels that carried them. What they lacked in raw destructive power they compensated for with tactical flexibility and, crucially, with the enormous psychological authority that any cannon commanded simply by its presence. Because this is the central truth about the cannon in pirate warfare. It was rarely used to sink anything. Sinking a merchant vessel was the last thing a pirate wanted to do. A sunken ship took its cargo to the bottom of the sea, which benefited no one aboard the pirate vessel that had just destroyed it. The goal was always the prize intact, the cargo accessible, the vessel potentially saleable as an additional asset, the crew alive and capable of being questioned about where valuables were concealed. and what other ships might be encountered on the route ahead. The cannon, in pirate use, was primarily a persuasion instrument of the most emphatic possible kind. A single shot fired across the bow of a merchant vessel, deliberately placed to pass ahead of the ship rather than into it, close enough that the sound and the splash were unmistakable, was the standard opening communication. It said, without ambiguity or the possibility of misinterpretation, that the vessel behind you has artillery, knows how to use it, and is choosing for the moment not to use it destructively. The invitation embedded in that choice was clear. Heave to, strike your colors, make this easy, and what comes next will be manageable. Make it difficult, and the next shot will be aimed differently. A surprising number of merchant captains accepted this invitation without requiring further demonstration. Those who did not face the chain shot and the bar shot. Specialized ammunition consisting of 2 iron balls connected by a length of chain, or a solid bar, which when fired tumbled through the air in a wide, scything rotation, and was designed specifically to destroy rigging. Not the hull, not the crew, the rigging, the sails and lines and spars that gave the vessel its ability to move. A well-placed shot of chain or bar could bring down a mast, tear a sail to strips, cut the running rigging that controlled a ship's course, and reduce a capable vessel to a drifting, directionless thing that could neither fight effectively nor flee at all. After which the question of resistance tended to resolve itself. This precision of intention, the use of artillery not to destroy but to disable, to control, to create a specific and manageable situation, represents a level of tactical sophistication that is not always credited to the men who employed it. Pirates are often imagined as blunt instruments of violence, interested only in destruction. But the cannon fire of the Golden Age, carefully examined, tells a different story. It tells of men who understood their weapon deeply enough to calibrate its use with considerable subtlety, who knew the difference between a shot that ended a confrontation and a shot that ended a prize, and who chose accordingly. The cannon's voice carried across the water and arrived before anything else, before the boarding party, before the cutlass and the pistol and the axe. It set the terms. It defined the situation. It was the first word in every conversation that followed, and it was spoken in a register that left no room for misunderstanding. Iron cast in fire, cooled in darkness, bored to precision by patient hands, loaded and aimed and fired by men who had learned its language as thoroughly as they had learned any other. The sea carried its sound for miles. And in the silence after, the world rearranged itself around what that sound had meant. Every object outlasts the hand that made it. This is one of the quiet, persistent truths of history, that the things human beings produce with such urgency, with such specific and immediate purpose, have a way of continuing long after the urgency is past and the purpose has dissolved into the past. The cutlass rusting on the ocean floor, the flintlock pistol behind museum glass, its mechanism still functional after 300 years. The boarding axe hanging in a maritime collection in a building that was not yet built when the axe was last used. These objects carry something forward through time that no document quite manages to carry. A physical, tactile record of what the world was like when they were made and when they were used, when the hands that held them were warm, and the sea around them was real, and the stakes were as high as stakes ever get. We have spent considerable time with these weapons. The cutlass, forged from need and shaped for close quarters, the perfect instrument of an imperfect world, the flintlock pistol, worn in multiples because its singular limitation demanded it, as much a theater prop as a firearm in the hands of men who understood that fear was more efficient than violence. The boarding axe, that honest, dual-natured thing that refused to be only one thing when circumstances demanded it, be several. The blunderbuss, loud and imprecise, and devastatingly suited to the spaces where precision was impossible and volume was sufficient. And the cannon, the great persuader, the voice that carried across water and set the terms of every conversation that followed it. Taken individually, each of these weapons is fascinating. Taken together, they form something more than a list of armaments. They form a portrait of an age. The golden age of piracy was not a romantic period, despite everything that subsequent centuries have done to make it appear so. It was a period of genuine brutality, of enormous human suffering on multiple sides of every encounter, of men and women living at the absolute margins of what the civilized world would tolerate, and often well beyond those margins. The weapons they carried were not glamorous in the hands that held them. They were heavy, and they were cold in the early morning, and they smelled of oil and powder and salt. And the people who depended on them for survival understood them with a clarity that no amount of retrospective romanticization can fully obscure. And yet, there is something that keeps drawing us back, something about this period, these people, these objects, that refuses to release its hold on the imagination across 300 years of intervening history. We make films and write novels and build museum exhibitions and name sports teams, and all of it circles around the same gravitational center. The figure of the pirate, armed and dangerous and operating outside the boundaries that the rest of the world had agreed to observe. Perhaps what draws us is the freedom implied in that outsider status. The pirate existed, however briefly and however violently, in a space where the ordinary rules had been suspended, where a man born with nothing could, through audacity and skill and a willingness to accept extraordinary risk, accumulate wealth and authority, and a kind of terrible fame that the legitimate world had no mechanism for producing at equivalent speed. The weapons were the tools of that possibility. They were what made the outside of the law survivable, at least for a time. Perhaps what draws us is simpler than that. Perhaps it is merely the objects themselves, the weight of the iron, the elegance of the mechanism, the evidence encoded in every surface of a world that made things carefully and used them hard. There is an honesty to a well-made weapon from this period that is difficult to articulate but easy to feel. It was made for a purpose. It served that purpose. It has lasted. The sea keeps its own archive. In the warm shallows of the Caribbean, in the cold, deep water off the Carolina coast, in the harbors of West Africa and the straits of Madagascar, there are ships on the bottom that went down with their full complement of these weapons aboard. Cutlasses in their racks, pistols in their cases, cannons still in their carriages, pointed at a horizon they will never reach. The salt and the pressure and the slow work of time are doing what time always does. But the iron persists longer than almost anything else, and there are objects down there that, if raised and cleaned and examined by careful hands, would tell us things about the craft and the commerce and the violence of the age that no document has managed to record. We are still finding them. We will continue to find them. And when we do, when a conservation team lifts something from the sediment and the shape of it resolves in the light into something recognizable, something that was last held by a hand that has been gone for 3 centuries, there is a moment of connection that is unlike almost anything else that history offers. The object bridges the distance. The weight of it is the same weight. The grain of the wood, if wood has survived, is the same grain. The mechanism, if the mechanism is intact, will move under a careful finger in the same way it moved under the finger that last cocked it. These weapons were made by people who will never be remembered, carried by people who are mostly forgotten, used in service of purposes that history has judged harshly, generously, and everything in between, depending on the century and the perspective. But the objects remain, patient, iron, heavy with everything they've witnessed, waiting, as they have always waited, for the next careful hand to find them.